Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Hunter. I'm the Acting Director of the Office of Child and Family Services, and I would like to welcome you to our September school-based mental health lunch and learn. We are delighted to have you here. The purpose of this two-part workshop is to provide K-12 teachers and staff with an understanding of adverse childhood experiences and their impact on student behavior and learning. You will learn practical strategies to create a trauma-informed classroom and to support students who have lived experience with trauma. We encourage your active participation with fellow participants in sharing your insights and asking questions. Once again, we extend a warm welcome and wish you a productive and rewarding experience. I will now turn it over to Janet Imobisa.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, all. I am Janet Imobisa, the training coordinator for the Office of Child and Family Services, and I'll be your moderator for today. Thank you for gathering with us for our second session of the School-Based Mental Health Lunch and Learn series. It is my pleasure to introduce today's instructor for our training initiative, Trauma-Informed Teaching, Understanding ACEs and Supporting Students Through Brain-Based Pedagogical Strategies, Dr. Stacy Patton. Dr. Patton is a remarkable individual whose life's journey and professional accomplishments are nothing short of inspirational. She's a true advocate for children's well-being, a survivor, and an award-winning journalist, and also a college professor. Her work has touched countless lives, and her insights into child welfare issues, higher education, race, and culture have been featured in prestigious publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, BBC News, the Cairo, Matter, and among so many others. As an author with numerous publications in various formats, Dr. Patton is also the creator of www.sparethekids.com, which is an online platform devoted to educating others about the harmful effects of spanking children. Moreover, she has developed the innovative 3D medical animation app, When You Hit Me, which is aimed at helping healthcare professionals and parents comprehend the multi-organ, multi-system consequences of physical discipline on children. As a child advocate, Dr. Patton travels the nation delivering powerful keynote speeches and professional training sessions, which addresses issues such as racial disparities in behavioral health, child abuse cases, foster care, and psychotropic medications for children of diverse backgrounds. As a researcher and author, Dr. Patton's commitment to the field and the scholarly canon in general has not gone unnoticed. In 2016, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children recognized her with the Outstanding Service and Advancement of Cultural Competency and Child Maltreatment Prevention and Intervention Award. And most recently, she received the prestigious Distinguished Contribution to Child Advocacy Award from the American Psychological Association this year, 2023. Currently serving as a research associate and professor at both Morgan State and Howard University, she is a beacon of hope and knowledge in the field of trauma-informed teaching and child advocacy. Her vast experience, expertise, and dedication to advancing child behavioral health and welfare make her an invaluable resource for our training today. We're honored to have Dr. Stacy Patton join us and share her expertise and insights, which will enrich our understanding of trauma-informed teaching and its impact on our students. Do know that all presentation material will be provided at the conclusion of this training. So with that being said, please join me, y'all, in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Stacy Patton, and I yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. If I could get everybody to do me a huge favor and unmute your cameras, unmute your mics so I can feel you, so I can see you, so I can hear you. And I just want to do a quick little thing to get us warmed up. So if you don't feel comfortable doing it, that's fine. But I really, really get a lot of energy off of seeing you and seeing if I'm making sense, if you're feeling what I'm saying. If we could do that just for a quick second. And everybody, if you could just unmute your mic real quick, because I want us to say something together. Really, really important mantra. Can we do that? Okay. All right. This is so much better. Okay. Everybody ready? After I want you guys to repeat after me. Okay. This really important, simple yet profound sentence. Is everybody ready to do this? Can I hear a yes? Can I hear a yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, here we go. Now I want you to say it like it's August and it's Book of Revelations hot out and we're in a church tent revival somewhere. Childhood.
Childhood.
Okay, y'all gotta do better than that. Childhood
Childhood
is about surviving
is about surviving
adults.
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 Okay. All right. All right. So you can mute your mics again, but I want you to hold on to that very simple yet powerful sentence as we take this journey together this afternoon. I am case number KC114343 from New Jersey's Child Welfare System. I'm an adoptee, a child abuse survivor, and I was able to thrive through my K-12 and higher education experiences because I had educators who were trauma informed even before trauma informed became a thing. So I graduated from high school in the late 1990s and went to college in the early 2000s. And so what I want to do today is share a lot of information with you all to educate you about what ACEs are and how they show up in the classroom experience and to start getting you to think about how you can be brain-based educators. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick here so you can see our agenda. As Janet indicated, I will be making these slides available to you all. And so if you have any questions, you can always give me a holler via email. So the purpose of today's workshop, this is in 2 sections. We're going to talk about ACEs, give you guys an understanding of what they are. Part 2 is going to give you some practical strategies to create a trauma-informed classroom and to support students who've experienced trauma. So we're going to talk about what ACEs are, how they show up in the classroom, what their impact is on students. You're going to learn how to identify symptoms of trauma and also how they manifest in the classroom. Understanding the importance of a trauma-informed approach to teaching. So sort of why do we need to do this? Because we want to make sure we don't escalate, that we don't re-traumatize students, that we don't particularly in Black and Brown communities, sets students up for the school to prison pipelines. And we want to implement strategies to create safe and supportive classroom environments and develop skills to support students who've experienced trauma. I'm just going to end this for a second because I'm not seeing, let's see, the gallery view. I'd like to see, here we go. All right, I'm going to share this again. There we go. All right. Okay, that's better. I get to see your beautiful faces. All right. Okay, so to get us started, I want to give you guys a sense of what a trauma-informed educator looks like, what it sounds like to be one, what it feels like to be one. Now, I don't teach K-12 students, although I do have a lot of interactions with them through my workshops and such. I teach students on the other end, so 18-year-olds to 24-year-olds. So I'm still getting them when their brains are still in flux. And my students are bringing a lot of different types of traumas, even educational traumas, with them in their bodies when they arrive to campus. But I just want to start this off. Here's a video that I show at the beginning on the very, very first day of class, because I want my students to know right away that I am safe to learn from. So let's have a listen.
She landed a position of a lifetime as a professor at the Howard University School of Communications. You know her as Professor Stacy Patton or Dr. P.
Hello, my scholars, and welcome to a new semester of learning. I'm Dr. Stacy Patton, but my students affectionately call me Dr. P. I teach media literacy and digital storytelling courses. I'm an award-winning journalist. I've written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, BBC News, the Chronicle of Higher Education, News One, Black Enterprise, and some other outlets. I've been on TV. I've appeared on MSNBC, ABC News, CNN, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, and Fox News. I've also written 3 books, and I'm working on my 4th book, which is about the lynching of Black children during Jim Crow. Let's see, what else? I play basketball. I love to garden. I've got a pet parrot named Lady Zora. I once fell in love with a furball named, guess what? Not my cat. And sometimes I like to drop bars for fun.
I'm Dr. P. I got students galore. You might have a lot of students, but I got much more. My students don't snooze and they don't snore. My classes stay lit, they're never a bore. Y'all gonna swim, ain't nobody sinking. I'm a teacher all about critical thinking. Now what to think, but how to think. Read between the lines and find the common links. Yeah.
So my career in journalism began when I was a 12-year-old paper girl for the Trenton Times newspaper in New Jersey. I got up every morning before sunrise, delivered the news to 100 customers in my neighborhood. Years later, I attended Johns Hopkins University, then studied journalism at NYU. After that, I got my PhD in African American history from Rutgers University. While I was in college, I got my first reporting job at the Baltimore Sun newspaper, where I wrote for the Metro desk and then the features department. Then I was a reporter for the Washington Post. After that, I was a senior enterprise reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I covered graduate studies, faculty research, race, and diversity issues. My biggest story ever for the Chronicle was about the rising numbers of PhDs on food stamps. My most viral and controversial story ever was a piece for the Washington Post about the infamous Baltimore mom who beat her son during the Freddie Gray uprising in 2015. More recently, I've written about the impact of COVID-19 on Black people, white people's participation in racial protests, the 3 Black women prosecutors presiding over Donald Trump's cases, the Montgomery River boat brawl, the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision and its impact on HBCUs, and so much more. I've also published chapters in 3 books. I write a great deal about the treatment of children, obsessively so. I believe that children should never be hit under any circumstance, and that they should be entitled to the same rights to bodily integrity as adults. So I travel around the country teaching audiences about the physical and psychological harms that hitting children causes. I'm even designing a 3D medical animation app called When You Hit Me. I'm hoping that it will be a powerful child abuse prevention tool. I was recently given the Distinguished Contribution to Child Advocacy Award from the American Psychological Association for this work. I've been teaching at the college level for over a decade. Before coming to Howard, I taught at Rutgers University, Montclair State, American University, and Morgan State. I love teaching, and I love my students. Why do I love teaching? Well, for me, it's not merely just about the transfer of facts or the dissemination of information confined to the pages of a textbook. No, it's something far more profound. I love teaching because it's a journey, a transformative odyssey, an endeavor to shape not just minds, but hearts and souls. I have very high expectations of my students. I'm about teaching as well as I was taught. I believe that education is truly a gift to my scholars. It's a tapestry woven by the hands of mentors who believe in the power of critical thought, who understand that education is not just about dictating what to think, but empowering young scholars to explore how to think. So my role as your professor is to be the catalyst that sparks the flames of curiosity within every single one of you. I want you to write and create what makes your heart beat fast, to produce what feels dangerous, This, my scholars, is the prelude to truth. I want you to write with fire and edit with compassion. I want you to remember that the most profound truths often reside on the precipice of what seems risky. It is at this edge that we discover our potential, our capacity to contribute to the symphony of human understanding. To those of you sitting in your seats right now, wondering about the high expectations I hold for you, I do so because I too stood where you stand now. I was fortunate to be molded by educators who believed in my capabilities, who saw in me what I couldn't yet fully perceive. Their belief, their unwavering standards, it all drove me to surpass my own limitations. So today, I stand before you not just as your professor, but as a product of the transformative power of education. So, as we start this journey together, let us be fearless of the challenges that await. Let us be fueled by the boundless potential that our time together offers. Let us remember that our quest for knowledge is not just a pursuit of answers, but a dance with questions that have the power to reshape the world. My scholars, welcome to this realm of boundless exploration, to this nexus of inspiration and aspiration. Welcome to Dr. P's classroom, where thinking is liberated, creativity is celebrated, and growth is inevitable. Together, we shall embark on a voyage that is marked by collaboration, curiosity, and the courage to embrace the unknown. Let's get it, y'all. So I want to stop here and ask you all a question. As you listened and watched, how did you feel inside of your body? Anybody? What were you feeling? What were you thinking?
Happy.
Happy? Why did you feel happy, Laura?
I like the video. I like the New Jersey stuff. So yeah, it was just a really heartwarming video.
Okay. Anybody else? How did you feel inside your body? We can do a show of hands. How many of you felt safe? How many of you felt a sense of connection? How many of you felt like you wanted to cry, whether it was joyful tears, were you moved? How many of you felt inspired? How many of you felt like you could take a class with this professor? Okay, right? And so I show you all this to give you a sense of what a trauma-informed teacher sounds like with her voice, the language that she uses, with music, with visuals. So as an educator, I know that from day one, regardless of where my students come from, what kinds of backgrounds they have, what kinds of stories they bring to the classroom, that my job is from day one to attach to my students and to send a message that I am safe to learn from. Now, it just so happens that I know how to use a cell phone to create a video like this. I use this, taking pictures throughout the semester of my teaching, my interactions with students. I have students live tweet. We'll talk about that next time around some of those classroom strategies. But I collect all of this visual material from my own camera, but also from them to help shape the narrative of what kind of teacher I am, and to give students right away a sense of what kind of experience they're going to have. And so there's lots of free editing apps, and I'm happy to do a separate tutorial with you one-on-one to show you how to do this in your own classroom setting, so that you could take the first 2-3 minutes at the beginning of every semester to tell your own story, because students don't care what you know until they know that you care. And right away, you do that through your story and by setting the tone right away. So that's why I wanted to start off giving you that kind of visual so that you could see what that felt like in your body, to see an educator use that kind of technology and storytelling. I'm going to share my screen again and go back to my slides here. Okay. All right. So for today, our agenda is to grapple with a really big question. What happened to their brains? So a few years ago, when I was teaching at Morgan State University, I was the youngest faculty member in my department, and I was teaching a lot of freshmen and sophomores especially, so just coming out of high school, new to college. And a lot of the professors were mostly boomers, who had worked in newsrooms and then came into the college scene as a result of a lot of downsizing in journalism. And at faculty meetings, I would hear a lot of griping. These students are lazy, they're not reading, they're not doing the work, they're dysregulated, they don't pay attention, they have behavioral issues. This is at the college level. And so I would sit and I would listen and I would say, there's something else going on here. And I was saying a lot of this because of the work that I do on trauma and corporal punishment, but also digital addiction. And so I understand how environments, early childhood environments, shape young people's brains, the way they're wired, the way they function, their nervous systems, their psychology, their sense of self, and their behaviors in the classroom. And so I kept trying to say, no, there's something else going on here. We've got to flip our classrooms. We've got to be trauma informed. We've got to do brain-based teaching. And a lot of the faculty would sort of look at me like, I don't have time to do that. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a clinician. I'm not, their parents, their therapists, all of those sorts of things. And I can respect that. You're paid to get, to come in and teach a subject and do your job. But we're not going to be effective if we don't understand what happened to young people's brains. And so I started looking into this some more and developed a whole workshop series that I do with K-12 teachers, social schools, social work schools, education colleges, college programs as well, and with faculty. And so today we're going to take a look at this, what happened to their brains, because that context is important to helping us understand what we're seeing. So we're going to do a quick icebreaker with each other. I'm going to talk about ACEs, so defining what they actually are. A lot of educators don't know what ACEs are. I've met pediatricians, whole pediatricians, who are not grounded in ACEs, even though they're offering diagnosis and such. I'm going to talk about the prevalence of ACEs in our communities. We're going to talk about different types of trauma, what they are, what they look like. We're going to learn some things about the brain. Now, it's not going to be complicated, I promise you. I won't make it boring. And so we're going to talk about how ACEs changes the brain. Then I'm going to move to talk about physical punishment. So spanking children, even when it doesn't leave marks on children's bodies, how it alters the physical architecture of the brain and impacts learning and behavior. And then I'm going to also talk about digital addiction, and particularly for Gen Z, well, I would say millennials, Gen Zs, and alphas now, those generation of students. So what you're seeing in the classroom could be a combination of environmental traumas, family traumas, and also exacerbated by too much screen time. And then we're going to talk about identifying common symptoms that we're seeing, and talk about how trauma affects learning and behaviors, and then how you recognize those triggers in the classroom. Some of this we'll get into more detail during part 2. So does that sound good to everybody? Can I get some thumbs up, head nods, anything? Okay, great. So let's start with our icebreaker. I call this 2 truths and a hope. So here's a chance where you get to introduce yourself and sort of quickly share 2 truths and a hope. So the truths are, you can share a personal or professional truth about yourself or your experiences with trauma-informed teaching, if any. And so I have an example there. And a hope is what do you hope to gain or achieve during this workshop? It could be new strategies, insights, etc. So anybody want to share truth and hope? Yes.
I'll start.
Sure.
Two truths or just one truth you want?
You could do one or two, whatever you feel like doing.
So I'm actually a licensed clinical social worker. Um, so I do work with a lot of kids. I'm not in the state of Virginia, actually. And a hope would be I want to learn more about the ACEs. I'm curious with which ones I'm overthinking since I typically work with some extreme ACEs, I think. So I want to see what other ones are that I'm missing.
Okay. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who else wants to share? Truths and hope. Even if you're eating lunch, you can talk with your mouth full. It's fine. No judgment here, safe space.
I can go.
Yes.
Um,
Hi, Ashley.
Hi. Um, I am a licensed professional counselor, but in a school setting, so kind of different. My hope from this workshop, I guess, is I'm very trauma informed already. I'm about to be EMDR trained. So I really just want to see the approach where I'm on the other side of things. Like I'm not a teacher, but I watch the teachers and how they interact with kids and just learn more about like things that I could offer for them to have a more trauma informed class.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ashley. Anybody else? Truth
I
and
can go
hope.
next.
Hi, is it Michaela?
Yep. So my name is Michaela. I am the outpatient supervisor at Southside Behavioral Health Community Services Board. And currently my work as far as like ACEs training, we are focusing really heavily on our We Stand Together campaign. So shameless plug. We had gotten a lot of great feedback from our campaign, and as far as ACEs existing within the LGBTQ plus community. And I guess one hope is we currently have staff within the school system. So just understanding more about how I can support as a supervisor for my clinicians that are stepping into the school system.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michaela. Anybody else? Two truths, a hope. Going once, twice, three times. Okay, so thank you for that. I appreciate the sharing. All right. All right, so let's get into what ACEs are. Okay, so ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. The story of ACEs dates back to 1998 when there was a big study with authors from Kaiser Permanente, the CDC, and two other universities where they interviewed adult patients about certain early childhood experiences. And you see a list here of what some of those experiences were. And I believe it was around 170,000. I think that numbers are right. I have to check it. But thousands of kids, most of adults who were interviewed about their childhood experiences. And they wanted to try to track it to see if there were links between early child trauma and their health outcomes and their behaviors and other social consequences. What a lot of people don't know is that the majority of the participants in that initial ACEs study were white middle-class kids. There's another study called the Philadelphia ACEs study, which is expanded, and it was much more diverse to include Black and Latino communities as well. And they had other types of traumas that were listed, including racial trauma and certain kinds of neighborhood outcomes as well. And so this is some data to give you a sense of what that first ACEs study revealed. So I'm sorry, my number was way inflated. 17,000 study participants in that original Kaiser Permanente study. So you can get a sense of the different types of traumas that were talked about on that original study. And so you could look at that infographic a little bit in more detail on your own. These were the risk factors here. So if you're somebody who had zero ACEs, you had a wonderful, beautiful childhood, nothing ever happened to you, the only pain you felt was from your own laughter and joy, you had a very low risk of these possible behavioral and physical and mental health outcomes shown in this chart below. But the more experiences you had, you got a score of a 1, 2, 3, and then 4 plus ACEs. So I'm somebody who would be in this category right here because I experienced, adoption, which at the time was not considered an ACE or a trauma, but now increasingly adoption is considered an ACE. It's a trauma. It's a separation and a primal wound between parent and child. Being in foster care also was later added to that expanded study, and so forth. So this is just, all these numbers are just based on that first ACEs study. Here's some more data here, more recent data to give a sense of what kinds of traumas and ACEs kids are increasingly being exposed to. So of course, physical, psychological, sexual violence, community or school violence. So there's a lot of bullying that's going on. We can add cyberbullying, which was not part of that original ACEs study because kids weren't, carrying these things around. There wasn't YouTube where you could, post somebody getting beat up at school. You can spend a lot of time on these social media platforms and see school fights, students attacking teachers. It's really quite a messy situation. So witnessing or experiencing domestic violence, natural disasters, climate change is going to be an ACE. So we're going to be seeing that increasing as we're seeing all kinds of floods and fires, et cetera, and displacement going on a global scale. Violent loss or sudden loss of a loved one, refugee or war experiences, military, family-related stresses, physical or sexual assault, neglect, et cetera. Okay. Here's another infographic here that I've put here just to give you sort of visual sense of what's happening and how prevalent ACEs are. So for someone like me who's teaching college students, I am increasingly seeing young people coming to campus with all kinds of ACEs. And our mental health services on college campuses, this is across the country, are stretched thin. The waiting times to get in to see a counselor can be weeks or months. Sometimes we're having students come in who don't have health insurance to be able to cover those things. We're seeing suicide rates, suicide ideation, increasing, particularly among freshmen who are making those transitions. Our suicide rates on campuses have elevated as well because these kids are coming in from their early childhood K-12 experiences and haven't had the sort of therapeutic interventions at the K-12 level, and they're carrying them to campuses with them. Here are some more fast facts, and I just want to let you know that all of these links are live. So this is some embedded research for you all to click on and do deeper reading into the data, into the studies. I put all the latest years available for you all just to get a sense of a deeper dive into the research, okay? And even more data here about trauma in general. This is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to give you a sense of the risk factors. So people who experience early traumas have higher rates of becoming suicidal, addicted to drugs, having mental health issues, and so forth. And all that data comes from here as well. So you can take advantage of the deeper dive reports. And there's some more studies here for those of you that really, really want to get into the research as well. So I won't go through all of those, but I've grouped them by types of trauma and outcomes for you. Okay. How many of y'all have heard of the vagus nerve, the ventral vagus nerve? One person. Anybody heard of the polyvagal theory? Okay. So there's this nerve that extends from your brain and touches every major organ in the body, your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your digestive system. It plays a critical role in regulating all of these functions. So I know this is going to sound really weird, but on the first day of class, when my students walk in, whether I have a class of 20 students or like this semester, I have one class with 77 students, I picture my students' amygdalas and their vagus nerves. Of course, they have flesh and blood. They've got faces, they've got hair. I recognize their diversity, but I am intentionally trying to, if I had X-ray vision, look into their bodies and see this nerve going down from the back of their brains and touching all of these organs. And I do this because it's a reminder that I must be gentle and I must make them feel safe in their bodies. Because if this vagus nerve is dysregulated, right, which is so key to their nervous system, to how their brain functions, it's going to impact how they show up in my class, right? And I'll talk a little bit later on why the amygdala is so very important to all of this. So I want you to start understanding what these different body parts do underneath the flesh, because once you really delve into the psychology, into the anatomy, into the neuroscience, it will change the way you look at young people. It will change the way you teach. It will also help you become in tune with your own triggers, because as educators, we sometimes bring our own untreated traumas and unresolved issues into the classroom with us, including our own biases about young people. Also, our unconscious biases about race and class, gender, sexuality, all of those sorts of things. And so this vagus nerve is so important because it is involved in emotional regulation and stress response for all of us, regardless of age or life experiences. So when students feel safe and relaxed, their vagus nerve is more active. And when that nerve is more active, it can enhance their ability to learn and focus. So in our next section, we're going to talk about what kinds of classroom strategies do we do to bring that vagus nerve online, okay? And there's all kinds of cool things. I'm going to introduce you guys to my reflect orb that I use at the beginning of every class. So it takes biometric feedback from students. And there's an app that's connected to it, and I can tell whether the whole class is dysregulated or calm. And we work with fidgets and things like that. So the students absolutely love the fidgets. They can drive you a little nuts though, so you have to be very careful about what kind of fidgets you bring, because they could be kind of loud. But we're going to talk about how we bring that vagus nerve online. So when students are stressed or anxious, activity decreases. So it makes it harder for them to concentrate and engage. So you have a lot of students who will come in, they're danger mapping, they're looking around, they're hypervigilant, and they're just not open to what you're trying to teach, okay? And so understanding this nerve, what it does and how it, supports emotional well-being, reduces stress, can help students with their behavioral issues and also learning, okay? I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Dan Siegel's work, but one of my favorite aspects of his work is talking about the window of tolerance, right? And the vagus nerve fits into this. So as educators, we need to think about students' nervous system health. We want to move students from this sympathetic part of the nervous system, so hyperarousal, and the parasympathetic hypoarousal, where learning does not occur, to the ventral vagal space where social learning and engagement and new learning occurs, okay? So I've put a little infographic here. So hypoarousal is when students are anxious, overwhelming, they're in fight or flight mode. Okay. And so when you're in fight or flight mode, you're in survival mode. So the body's excess resources for listening, for processing information is it's offline. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about corporal punishment and yelling and those sorts of things. And so, and then we go from that to hypoarousal, where they shut down, they're zoning out, they're disconnecting, they're freezing, they're sort of paralyzed, right? And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. How many of y'all have read Dr. Bruce Perry's What Happened to You? It's with Oprah Winfrey. At first, I side-eyed it because it was with Oprah, and I'm like, what does she know about developmental psychology? But I absolutely love this book. It's very accessible, easy to read, and a real page turner for me. But this page right here, I took out of the book and I printed it out. I have it on my desk at school. I keep it on my wall. It's, I use this in parent workshops on corporal punishment, because I hear a lot of parents say, well, I hit my child to teach them. And I'm like, that's not how the brain works, right? If I hear educators yelling at students or bringing fear into the classroom, I'm like, that's not how the brain works. They're not going to learn, right? And so I love this chart because it's a powerful reminder. So the way he's organized it is, at the top here, you have different brain states. There's 5 brain states: calm, alert, alarm, fear, terror. And then underneath the brain state, you've got the dominant brain part. So what parts of the brain are being engaged depending on the different brain states, right? And then you have the adaptive behaviors underneath there. So what are you doing when this part of your brain is engaged in this state? And then here we have cognition. So what is your cognitive ability, your ability to make good decisions, to reason, to control, regulate your emotions, and then your functional IQ. So the way this works is, if you're a parent or a teacher and you are calm, let's talk about this. Let's reason together. I'm at eye level, right? Because we're trying to get to a bridge of understanding. I'm not trying to punish you, shame you, make you afraid. You, as the educator, as the parent, and that the child, because two brains have the ability to co-regulate. You're operating from this pre-cortex region of the brain, this top part of your brain where higher thinking, higher reasoning happens. So when you're up here, everybody's calm. There's no violence. There's no fear. There's no coercion, right? You have the ability to what? Reflect, to create, to reason together, to come up with solutions, right? You can engage in abstract thinking, and your IQ is up here. And the child is right there with you. The student is right there with you. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Okay. Now, but if we move all the way across to terror, you're in the brainstem. That's back here. That primitive reptilian part of the brain that's less evolved than this prefrontal higher part of the brain, right? That's all survival there, right? It's a zero-sum game. It's fight or flight. It's defensiveness, right? And so the behaviors are flee, fight back, freeze, paralysis. You're all reflexive. You're reacting, right? You're not taking anything in. You guys know what this behavior. I'm sure you see it on a day-to-day, even with colleagues. And your functional IQ is down here. And so what I tell parents and other educators is that no new learning can be achieved. Once you get from alarm to fear to terror, it's all survival mode. All that oxygenated blood that you would normally use to get all this work of reflection, making connections, controlling your emotions, that leaves the brain and it goes to your limbs, your arms, your heart, right? So you could breathe, your lungs, all of that in fight and survival mode. There's no learning that's happening over here. Does that make sense to everybody? Can I get a thumbs up, a head nod, something? Okay. So print this out, put it on the refrigerator, put it on your desk, because I need that reminder when sometimes my students do crazy things and I want to just go like, why did you do that? Right. And I'll take a deep breath and I try to control my state. I'm going back to calm. I can be a little alert here, but I need to stay in this part of my brain. And so I ask a question. Help me understand why you did that. Or how old are you? And they'll say, I'm 19, Dr. P. And I will like literally zoom in on their foreheads, and I do something like this. And I'm like, 19. There's still stuff happening inside the brain yet. And it's a reminder for me to meet them where they are. But if I get dysregulated, I bring them in defensive mode and shutdown mode as well. Okay. So what is trauma? We've all experienced some kind of trauma, some kind of loss, some kind of pain. And sometimes that trauma, those losses, can have adverse effects on how we function, right? How we move through the world, how we work, how we play, how we love, how we parent, how we teach. Trauma is physical, it's emotional, it's spiritual. We can inherit our ancestors' traumas, right? Before we're even born. So we'll talk later about epigenetics and how that fits into this. There are social effects on survivors and families. So we have individual trauma and collective communal trauma, racial trauma, transgenerational trauma, intergenerational trauma, transgenerational epigenetic trauma. I mean, so there's all these different layers that people have been studying. So it has a lasting effect on students' ability to create and maintain positive engagement in all aspects of learning and interaction. So there are things that have happened to these young people before they even walk into your classroom, before they walk into your office, into the clinical space, into the social work, the child welfare system. And so there's 3 types of trauma. So you got single exposure, so that's type 1, type 2, one type of exposure that is repeated or exposure to 1 or 2 different events, then type 3, so toxic stress and developmental trauma disorder. Okay. Some basic areas, I'm not trying to turn y'all into neuroscientists, although it is very fascinating. There's a great book by Lou Cozolino called The Neuroscience of Education, The Neuroscience of Education. It's one of my favorite books, just for educators on this. But we want to talk about some basics, basic anatomy of the brain. We talked a little bit just now about the prefrontal cortex area, the cerebellum, hypothalamus, the pituitary, the amygdala, hippocampus. So I'm going to be touching on those different areas. When you really understand the brain, I promise you it will shift the way you interact, shift the way you interpret young people's behaviors, the way you read them, and the strategies that you use to react to their behaviors. It helps to give you some sort of context rather than throwing you into reaction. And it'll help you in other areas of your life too. Because sometimes with whole grown adults, when they are acting crazy and being really defensive and argumentative, I literally just will zoom in on the prefrontal cortex and I'll be like, prefrontal cortex is jacked. No new learning can be achieved here. And so I have to pull back and divert my attention somewhere else. With kids, it's different because the brain is in flux. It's still developing up to 24, some people say 25 years of age. So the impact of trauma has cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual, social effects. So cognitive, so their ability to process thoughts and to make good judgments. Emotional, so looping with emotions of shame, guilt, fear, anger, and pain. Physical, it gets in the body. Trauma can live in the body. There's a term called allostatic load. So this is, the amount of toxic stress that can be accumulated in your body over time. So this affects your muscles, your joints, digestion, metabolism, temperature, sleep, immune system, and so forth. So this stress and trauma can cause wear and tear on your immune system. Okay, this is when we get into the ACEs and sort of looking at how those early childhood experiences show up in our health outcomes. And particularly, especially for communities of color, which have disproportionately higher rates of health outcomes because of environmental conditions, eco hazards, food apartheid systems, uh, police brutality, other types of violence and structural inequalities. Those affect the health outcomes of people in these communities. Okay. Then spiritual, our worldview, how we understand life, society, social, meaning our relationships with our families, friends, colleagues, teachers, and so forth. So how does trauma affect learning? So I just gave you a little snippet looking at Dr. Bruce Perry's chart about how terror and fear creates changes in the brain. And so when young people experience fear or terror, they immediately experience these biochemical surges in the body. And so think about when you're afraid, what happens? You feel your heart rate speed up, right? Your stomach gets a little queasy, you get butterflies, your breathing changes, your palms get sweaty, right? Your blood pressure goes up, you might sweat. And so a little stress is good, but not too much, right? We need a little bit of stress. Evolution has wired us to react to stressful situations to keep us safe. The brain's job is to keep the body safe. This begins at birth. So when children come into the world, they have no logic, they have no understanding of history, they have no understanding of ideology, race, patriarchy, sexism. They have none of that logic. Children come into the world, they are all sensory. They experience the world through their sensory receptors, their eyes, their nose, their mouth, their ears, and their skin. And it is in the first 1,000 days of life that children's environment, their environmental conditions, and their interactions with their primary caregivers shape their brain, tell their brain how to grow, how to wire, how to function. So a child's brain is telling it, can I attach to these people? Can I form a healthy, organized attachment? Do they pick me up? Do they hold me? Do they soothe me when I cry? Do they feed me? Do they change me? I have a secure attachment with these people. But evolution says this is non-negotiable. So a child will still attach to a caregiver who is neglectful and who is abusive because their survival depends on it. So a brain is an organ of adaptation. It will adapt to its social environments. And so if a child is experiencing terror and fear frequently, that child's brain is going to adapt, it's going to change. Does that make sense to everybody? Can I get head nods, thumbs up, something? Okay, so terror and fear create changes in the brain because of these biochemical surges throughout the body. So some of these kids might become frozen, always in a state of alertness, they're hypervigilant, and it affects their ability to process information. So processing verbal information, following directions, focusing, recalling what was heard, retaining information. In the home setting, a lot of times parents will look at all of this and think a child is being disobedient. A child is somehow engaged in a conspiracy against the adult to undermine their authority. And it's like, nope, that's not what's happening. Sorry, my screen jumped ahead. That's not what's happening. Your environmental conditions that you set in the first 1,000 days of life before a child has memory recall, before they've developed cognition, verbal skills, moral reasoning doesn't fire up until about age 10, till between 10 and 14, right? And so the foundation was set in those first 1,000 days of life. And so some of that stuff that they're seeing, these behavioral things, cognition, was set before a child started to have any sort of agency and control over their own brains. Okay. So more anatomy here. So the prefrontal cortex, just very simple breakdown for you all. And I want you guys to use these slides, take them, learn them, and use them in your own school settings, your own clinical settings, your own social work settings, and teach other people. So I'm sort of walking you through how to use this language and to make it simple. So the prefrontal cortex helps us think, plan, solve problems. That's higher reasoning. You want children, students to operate at full optimal capacity in this area. The amygdala is the brain's alarm system. It has, think of the brain as a government. So the amygdala has veto power over everything. The amygdala is like, oh, this is not safe. It's overriding all the other functions in the brain. So it's also, if it's overactive, it's a problem. So it's responsible for emotional memory, detecting emotions, fear, hyperactivity, anxiety, panic. The hippocampus, and this is especially important for learning. You don't want young people to have an underactive or a hypertrophic, something that's shrunk, hippocampus, because this is responsible for integrating memories, new learning, new information, right? And so this could help balance out that amygdala over there so that they can make good decisions, so they can make higher connections, so that they can reason and so forth, okay? But if this is underactive, it's going to make it really difficult for kids to be able to discriminate between past and present experiences. This is especially true for kids in foster care, like I was a foster kid. It's hard for us to trust, to read faces, to read situations without integrating them into the past where we think we're about to be re-traumatized, etc. The hypothalamus regulates several hormones and controls the body's stress response. We'll talk about some of those biochemicals a little bit later, so what those stress hormones actually are. So the hypothalamus can also sound the alarm, sending the body into fight or flight mode, raising stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Then the ventromedial prefrontal cortex helps with assessing safety and helps to regulate the amygdala. And then we talked about the brainstem, this primitive part, reacts to threats, fight, flight, freeze, collapse, fawning. Does everybody know what fawning is? So that's, I have college students who fawn sometimes, particularly Black male students who, when they are around female educators, will just, yes, ma'am. They do a lot of that and lowering themselves, making themselves small so they're not a threat, because they have experienced boyhoods where taking up space, they've been taught, makes people feel threatened and could get them in trouble. So they do all of this kind of fawning to say, I'm no threat. So that kind of fawning behavior. So there's different types of fawning behaviors, but that's the one that I've mostly seen as an HBCU professor. So, and we talk about neurochemical systems. So cortisol, too much of that can damage the hippocampus because it damages the cells there. Norepinephrine and adrenaline overwhelms the amygdala, which is what makes it hyperactive. The autonomic nervous system is really important. You need a whole semester to really break this down. This is part of the two parts of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So this is for fight, flight. So we see a lot of aggression, avoidance, procrastination. Parasympathetic, so freezing, fawning, disconnect, numbing. Synaptic and pruning is really important. It starts around, I'd say, about age 12. So basically, we have neurons, which, they can strengthen or they can be pruned away. So the brain, when the child is born, they've got all these neurons, all these possibilities of things that their brains can do, but their environment helps to determine what's going to be useful. So if you're in an environment where you always are in survival mode, that's what you're teaching the brain to adapt to really strengthen. But around age 12, 13 years old, some of those old, neurons get pruned away, they go away, and it could, or they harden. So you're going to be in survival mode, dangerous environments. Those are the skills that the brain is going to really hone in on rather than learning and taking in new information. But it's also a window of opportunity for young people who've had early childhood experiences with the right kind of educators, because for me, the right kind of educators were those who gave me a corrective relational experience. They intervened, They listened to me. They gave me models that I had not been exposed to before. They taught me new language, new ways of thinking, finding my voice, validating my experiences. They modeled consistency and care and non-judgment. And so right at that moment when I entered the foster care as a 12-year-old, foster care system as a 12-year-old, I was surrounded by social workers, clinicians, and teachers who helped do that work during this developmental time when my brain was pruning away old stuff and making new opportunities. Does that make sense to everybody when I'm talking about synaptic pruning? Okay. So I want to also talk about child abuse here and also corporal punishment. Corporal punishment, spanking, whatever semantics you want to use, it has been declared the newest ace on the block. Spanking a child is now considered an adverse childhood experience. And it has dire consequences. So these are the latest fatality rates for child abuse fatalities in the United States. These were taken right sort of as COVID was firing up. So we can see the racial disparities are very clear here. African American children experience disproportionately higher rates of both child abuse and child abuse fatalities, followed by Native American children. Okay. We still don't have a full picture of what happened during COVID. You'll read some headlines that say, oh, child abuse was down during COVID. And it's like, that's not necessarily true because kids were out of schools and teachers are primarily mandated reporters. They're the ones who consistently report the bulk of abuse. We do have some anecdotal data from call centers where there were a lot of kids who were calling in during COVID reporting physical abuse and sexual abuse. So that there was a huge uptick in what call centers were seeing during that time. So we still don't have the full picture in terms of the data though. This is so pre-COVID, so 2016 to 2020. Once again, you see African American children still having the highest rates of fatality, and those numbers have continued to go up. What is also exacerbating this, particularly in Black communities, so the 2020 George Floyd incident, we saw lots of calls to defund the police and also to defund child welfare. So the response is, well, we got to deal with racial disparities in, our juvenile justice outcomes and our adult prison system outcomes, but also in foster care, where Black children are more likely to be placed into foster care. They stay in foster care longer. They're more likely to be given psychotropic medications. There's increased numbers of children who go from foster care into the juvenile justice system. So these are called crossover youth. There's not enough collaboration between their teachers and school systems and the child welfare system. So you may have a kid in your class who's in foster care and who's acting out, and their behaviors are not contextualized as a result of loss, trauma, grief, being in foster care, all of that comes with being in the system. And so the kid ends up getting suspended or expelled or even arrested. And so these numbers are not good, but there are dangerous calls to defund child welfare, to just look away. There are increasing numbers of social workers, many whom are white. The majority of social workers in this country, as well as educators, are white and female. And so the response is, I don't want to be called a racist, so I'm going to screen this call out. I'm not going to report this family because I don't want to be called a racist. But then what happens is you talk to district attorneys and they've got a child who's severely injured or a child that's dead. And the first thing they do is they go into the social services reports, the DHS reports, and they'll see that this child has had sometimes dozens of screenouts. So I just want to just sort of give y'all this larger political context to show how we're not dealing with trauma and in terms of child abuse, and how we're leaving young children, particularly children of color, vulnerable to more abuse by just looking away and trying to make the numbers look good. I've also taken a look at, particularly in African American communities, some micro data. Between 2015 and 2020, we had 3,146 Black children killed as a result of child abuse. About 40% of this is physical abuse, and most of it is neglect. The bulk of the abuse fatalities are neglect or a combination. I wanted to look at the number of victims. So Black boys, in terms of raw numbers, suffer higher than girls. In terms of the perpetrators, Black women are abusing and killing children in these communities in higher numbers. When I was a child growing up, my adoptive parents were African American. They were middle class. And this is a statement that has reverberated across generations. So I'm an 80s kid, 80s, 90s kid. And I used to hear my adoptive mother say, if I don't whoop you, then the police will kill you. If I don't whoop you, the white man will beat you. The white man hates you. The white man, this and that. You know, so I'm 7, 8 years old. Like, who is this white man she keeps talking about? Was it Bob Barker from The Price is Right? Was it Alex Trebek? Was it Ronald Reagan? I didn't know who this elusive white guy she was talking about. The only person that I felt was going to seriously injure me or kill me was my Black adoptive mother, who was using violence because she said she loved me, because this is what Jesus would do, because she needed to save me from the prison system. And so I continue to hear parents say this today. Right? I go into these community spaces and to schools and do community conversations on corporal punishment and ACEs and trauma. And I hear this sentence over and over again. So when I do public health work, I have to, acknowledge the fears that these parents and communities have, but also traffic in the data and the facts. And so what I did was, during the Black Lives Matter movement, a mini journalistic outlet started tracking these numbers, the number of people who were killed by cops. And so these databases, you could disaggregate the victims by race and age. And so I disaggregated the number of Black children who were killed by cops between 2013 and 2018. So we had 41 who were killed. And the numbers for white children, I think the raw numbers were around 46 kids. But of course, white children's numbers are much larger than Black kids in terms of their population. And so I wanted to compare this against the government's annual child maltreatment reports that are released every year. So I disaggregated the number of Black children who were killed by their parents. And so the sentence goes like this: between 2013 and 2018, 41 Black children were killed by cops. During that same time period, 2,389 were killed by their own parents. Now, I don't say this in a Fox News Black on Black crime kind of way, but to say both are serious public health problems, both require our attention, both are traumatic to families and communities. During Trayvon Martin's killing, Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, that was devastating for Black children across this country. To turn on the news, to see the riots, to see the protests, to hear adults arguing whether unarmed children deserve to die. That was deeply traumatic. And that got into a lot of young people's psyche, into their spirits. It affected their learning. It affected their relationships with their teachers. Can I trust this teacher who shares the same racial background as the people who killed, Mike Brown? So there were a lot of these conversations happening in these communities. And parents of Black children were deeply traumatized, including white parents who had biracial kids or who had adopted children. How do I keep my kids safe in this country? So this was a deeply traumatizing time for young people. Spanking is still very prevalent in this country and around the world. The majority of children are being hit. They are going through their childhoods being hit by parents and caretakers. You hear a lot of people say, oh, these kids today are horrible. These kids today are disrespectful. You hear teachers saying it. I've heard social workers whose job it is to protect kids, make these sort of stereotypical statements as well. There's this myth that the law says it's illegal for you to physically discipline your children. That's not true. Every state has a law that says how you can appropriately strike a child's body. It varies by state. You hit a kid one way in Texas, it might be okay, but you do it that same way in Vermont, you could be arrested. So this is the latest data that shows you that the majority of kids are still being hit by their parents. Across gender, boys, okay, so we start to see spanking peak around about age 3 or 4 for both boys and girls, but across the developmental stone, the stages of childhood, from infancy all the way to age 17, boys are being hit more than girls. And in terms of the child abuse data, boys are abused more and killed at higher rates than girls. Okay. We talk a lot about patriarchy and sexism in this country, which are very real things, but sexist and patriarchal, misogynistic men are made. They are not born. They are a product of their early childhood experiences. So if we want to sort of get to the roots of why these men turn out to be the way they do, we got to go back to these early childhood experiences, the first 1,000 days of life, and looking at their interactions between mothers and their sons. And then we can also do this similar dynamics between girls and their fathers. You know, sometimes, you know, when parents are using violence with their children, and we sort of wonder why they grow up to be victims of domestic violence or perpetrators, there's this sort of cognitive dissonance. Parents are oftentimes their children's first bullies and teach them how to become future abusers. Some years ago, I worked with the American Psychological Association, which passed a resolution based on a half-century's worth of scientific study that shows that there is no positive impact to hitting children whatsoever. It changes their brain, it severely affects their mental health. And they got a lot of pushback from communities of color about this, because they felt that if the APA passes a resolution against this, then it's going to demonize families of color and put them at risk for arrest and incarceration. That has not happened, by the way. The American Academy of Pediatrics, also, I worked with them on their policy statements against hitting children. They had a previous policy statement back in the early 1980s, I believe, against hitting kids. And so now there are calls among clinicians and pediatricians to have conversations with parents about the harms of hitting children, about how hitting children changes their brains, how hitting children will affect their behavior, their learning outcomes, and their the way their immune system works and other parts of their bodies. Elizabeth Gershoff, I'm an Elizabeth Gershoff groupie. She is like the godmother of corporal punishment research. She knows everything about this. Some years ago, she did a meta-analysis looking at all the studies that had ever been done on corporal punishment. So this is non-injurious physical abuse. This is hitting a child and it leaves no marks behind. But these are the negative outcomes that spanking a child has on kids. So these are all the studies that she looked at and the outcomes. So within the scientific community, ladies and gentlemen, there's a consensus that hitting children is not good for them. These are the major organizations that have come out against hitting children based on the research, based on the principles of children's rights. And this is regardless of race or ethnicity. Sometimes you'll hear people invoke culture to say, this is my culture, this is what we do, this is how we raise our kids. But it's not true. A brain is a brain is a brain is a brain, right? Regardless of your race or ethnicity, your religious background, your geographic background, unless you're somebody who traffics in racist pseudoscience, okay? And we've seen more media attention around this, some more headlines, sort of taking the science and distilling it down and showing parents the impact that it could have. So when I'm in school settings and you know, I'm in a public school doing a community conversation with parents, you know, I ask parents a series of questions. I say, how many of you love your kids? Everybody raises their hands. How many of you want your kids to be healthy? Everyone wants that. How many of you want your kid to have a high IQ, a brain that operates at optimal capacity? Everybody's like, yeah. How many of you want your kids to stay out of trouble, to make good decisions? They're all with me. And so then I switch the questions up and I'll say, how many of you want your kid to have a low IQ? Nobody's raising their hands. How many of you want your kid to experience gray matter reduction in the prefrontal cortex of the brain? Now, they might not know what gray matter is or the prefrontal cortex is, but it doesn't sound good the way I'm saying this. So everybody's like, no, right? So I start talking about the brain parts. And then I say to them, if I shared with you at least one thing you could do as a parent to ensure that your kids will have good behavior at school, will be able to listen, to process information, to learn, to be able to socialize with other kids and their teachers in a positive way, would you do it? And they're leaning in and they're like, yeah, tell us what that is. And I say, stop hitting your kids. Now, some people, they laugh it away. Some people are with me. Others are like, oh, here she goes, right? But they're still with me in this journey. So we have to talk about, how pain, how violence, verbal abuse changes the brain. Okay, so there's a doctor at Harvard University, Dr. Martin Teicher, who I interviewed years ago. He had done MRI studies on adults who had experienced non-injurious corporal punishment. And so these were not people who had marks on their bodies. They were not reported to CPS because of abuse, but they got regular spankings. And so what he did was he looked at the scans of those who were never hit as kids and those who got hit. And what he was able to see are these changes in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. We've already established why that part of the brain is so important. And so I told him at the time, I said, Dr. Teicher, you should compare the brains of adults who never got hit, those who got spanked, and those who were abused. And he did it. He went and he did a study, and he basically showed that the brains of people who got regular corporal punishment, no marks, just regular spanking, and those who got severely abused had the same brain changes, same architectural changes in the brain, right? So here are more like little infographics, and parents love these. You guys can download these things and give them away, post them in your office as well. So print them out. So that meta-analysis I was telling you about that Dr. Gershoff did, the big question was, does spanking change or improve children's behavior? And the research tells us no. This is based on 75 studies over 50 years, 13 different countries, over 160,000 children. And this is one of the infographics that I like to give out as well. So these are the unintended consequences that parents don't know about when they're using this parenting practice on their kids. The other thing too, I hear a lot of parents argue, and I've seen them argue this down with teachers and guidance counselors, that spanking isn't hitting. If I had $1 for every time somebody said that to me, I'd be able to pay off my student loans. And I have like close to $40,000 in student loan debt. So I hear this a lot. Spanking is hitting. And so we have to talk about it as a continuum of harm, from slight shoving, pinching, making kids do wall sits and, exercises, all the way to a fatality. The majority of substantiated child abuse cases, including fatalities, are not people who are sadistic monsters who are abusing their kids. These are parents who were spanking. This is regular corporal punishment that went wrong in a moment. So you take that out of your toolbox, those risks go down. And so I put in these slides here some talking points for you. I want y'all to take this to the Thanksgiving table this year. There's debates about corporal punishment in your family, and really talk about what the science says, that spanking a child is just as harmful as abuse that leaves visible marks and injuries. Right? So there are things that happen underneath the flesh that you cannot see. So a child's amygdala, the hippocampus, all those areas we've been talking about, that ventral vagus nerve, right? The adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys that release cortisol, that stress hormone that tells the child to go into fight or flight mode. The adrenal glands don't sit there and say, oh, wait, this is just a spanking. It's not severe abuse. Oh, wait, it's just her hand. She doesn't have a belt. Oh, wait, the intent is to teach me, is to love me, is to save me from prison. The adrenal glands, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, all of those brain parts, they understand none of that. Their job is to keep the body safe, to optimize survival, to adjust so the child can survive a threat to their physical body. And so we look at hitting children as a form of toxic stress that changes the brain, elevates the hormone, puts the child at risk for these other types of outcomes. There's a myth that Black people spank their kids more than other races. This is not true. There is no huge statistical difference by race in terms of Black people hitting their kids versus other groups. We tend to be a little bit more celebratory and public about it. White people tend to be a little bit more hidden with it, but they hit their kids just as much. And they don't live in areas they tend not to live in communities that are under hyper surveillance by the police and social services. So they have more resources and ability to skirt the attention of law enforcement and social services. The only group in terms of statistics that are less likely to endorse corporal punishment or to use it on their kids are Asians. And we can also correlate this with their educational outcomes. So if you look at all the educational statistics, Asian groups tend to outperform, all other groups in terms of those outcomes. We do need to interrogate this a little bit more because it just groups all Asians as if they're a monolith. So the Hmong people, the Chinese people, those are different groups. So they have different attitudes within them about corporal punishment. But when we look at these statistics, we can say that the majority of Americans across race and ethnicity hit their kids, the majority. We're a country that likes to beat kids. We also talk about the foster care to prison pipeline and the the school to prison pipeline and the foster care to prison pipeline. This is an infographic that I've put together to give you a sense of what those numbers look like. The message we send to parents is that when you hit your kids, these are the potential risk factors. They can end up being injured, placed in foster care, which then has these outcomes, incarceration, and at worst, death. Some of you will be floored to know that corporal punishment still exists in public schools in the United States. 18 states still allow children to be hit with boards like the one you see here on their backsides. Most of them are in the South. Teachers, principals, coaches, and other administrators are allowed to beat kids. A lot of the parents sign what's called opt-in forms to say, yep, I don't have time to come up there to deal with my kid, beat them. Many of these school districts have what's called immunity clauses. So if you injure a child while hitting them, you can be immune from prosecution. So about 200,000 kids are paddled each year. A lot of kids who get injured, having broken blood vessels, bones, nerve damages, there's no recourse. Okay. Actually, I need to change this number to 18 states because over the summer, Colorado got rid of corporal punishment in schools. So these are the states where it's still used in blue. The green states were the most recent, and we're going to add Colorado to that as well. There are school districts that are arguing to bring them back, particularly in Florida. There's no surprise there. Texas, no surprise there. Also, if you overlay this map with a map of the states with the highest rates of lynchings in the South, they correlate. So Mississippi is the #1 paddling state in the country. They were also the #1 lynching state. So one type of racial coercion and violence and punishment changed by another one. Okay, so I'm looking at the time and I actually have 4 minutes. I'm gonna pause there. We're gonna have to pick up with the ending of the rest of this for our next session. So there's a little bit more on ACEs and digital addiction. And so I'll pick up from there for the next one, and then we'll get into strategies, classroom strategies and such. Okay, but I wanted to stop there because I lost track of time, and we just have a few minutes for any quick questions or reactions so far. How's everybody doing? Is this helpful? Disturbing? Any feedback? Any questions?
I'm floored that you can get paddled at a public school. Like that just like I always heard jokes about it with like I was raised Catholic, my parents met at a Catholic high school, and I've always heard jokes about like the nuns, but that was like in the 70s, and now there's people doing it.
Yeah. And also, this might floor you even more. Every state, with the exception of New Jersey and Iowa, still allows corporal punishment in private and charter schools. So we have no idea how widespread this practice is in private schools because they don't have to report their data to the federal government, to OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. So this is just public schools. And, you know, they use excuses like, you know, these kids are out of control. We have these community problems, but that's because you've divested from schools. There's not enough resources. The pedagogy isn't, you know, culturally relevant. There's not enough therapists in schools. Families and communities are stressed out. So their solution is to beat kids. And so these Republican legislatures are the ones, you know, who are really like pining for this. Like, we got to do this. And then, you know, I'm looking at when I was writing Spare the Kids, a lot of people think it's interracial. Some of it is white teachers beating children of color, but the majority of it is these schools are segregated. So it's Black teachers, Black principals, Black coaches, the Black school boards, the Black NAACP. They're all like, yeah, this is what we need to get, you know, keep our kids from going to jail. And they don't realize that they don't understand the brain, that you're actually sowing the seeds for the very outcomes that you're trying to prevent, the learning outcomes that you're trying to prevent, the behavioral outcomes that you're trying to prevent. So yeah, a lot of people don't realize this is still happening.
It reminds me of that, like, oh, well, I was raised like that and I turned out fine and it's normal to them. So it's like, why not keep doing what's working?
Yeah, well, that the fact that they were, you know, hitting children is the only form of domestic violence that people invert as love, as something that's positive. So anytime I hear somebody say, yeah, I was hit and I turned out fine, and I'm like, nope, that statement right there lets me know you didn't turn out fine. And so, and then you'll have teachers who are dealing with behavioral issues in the classroom and will literally say, these kids need to be beaten. I mean, I hear it, you know, all the time. And also from police officers when they're encountering kids, you know, you need to take your kid home and beat them. So there's just such cognitive dissonance in our culture about, you know, these issues that we're seeing, the community violence that we're seeing, the bullying in schools, the attacks on teachers. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I have increasingly seen so many videos of kids attacking teachers. And COVID really exacerbated that. We had kids who lost 2 years of socialization and they came back to school with all kinds of traumas. We don't know what happened to them in a lot of these spaces. They removed SROs, so school resource officers, out of a lot of schools. And it was a nightmare. There were brawls, you know, in public schools all over the place. We have teachers who are leaving in droves, right? So if you want to disenfranchise the future, if you want to make sure you create a new generation of young people who don't grow up empowered and with the tools to think critically, to strategize, to heal, to improve their communities, to vote against harmful policies, what do? You attack their teachers. You make it so that teachers don't have the tools that they need to be effective in the classroom, right? Whether it's chalk or books or therapists in schools. You overcrowd their classrooms. You control their pedagogy to say, you got to teach this right here, right? So you divest from education and you have the very outcomes that we're all dealing with and that we're sitting in this workshop trying to understand and trying to create adaptive strategies for. So I apologize for sounding so cynical, but sometimes it's like I see the connections here. And so they want teachers to quit. They want these very outcomes to secure a future where communities remain unhealed and disempowered.
Wild.
Yeah. So any more questions, reactions? Hoping this is helpful so far. I still have a lot of information packed in. So a little bit more science info for next time. And then we're going to get into some actual strategies. I will share some things that I do in all of my classes. This works with K-12 and also folks in higher ed as well. So I'll combine both of those, the ending of this with those. And I think, Elaine, what I may do is put all of them on one big slide show for next time, so everybody can have everything together rather than two separate presentations. So it'll make sense.
Okay.
If that's okay.
All right. Well, Dr. Patton, thank you for today. I want to extend a warm thank you to all of you who hung in there. I know we went a little bit over. I'm sorry about that, but when the topic's worth talking about, it's sometimes worth the extra few minutes. Okay, so this was just part one. We will be back here on September 20th at 12 o'clock for part two. And please do not forget to complete the evaluation for today's session. Thank you.